History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 5, The Making of European Age. Chapter 4, Europe's Assault on the World. Perhaps this was inevitable. The Catholic monopoly in Spanish and Portuguese America was bound to mean a large measure of identification of the Church with the political structure. It was an important reinforcement for a thinly spread administrative apparatus, and it was not only crusading zeal which made the Spanish enthusiastic proselytizers. The Inquisition was soon set up in New Spain, and it was the Church of the Counter Reformation which shaped American Catholicism south of the Rio Grande. This had important consequences much later. Although some priests were to play important parts in the revolutionary and independence movements of South America. And though in the 18th century the Jesuits were to incur the wrath of the Portuguese settlers and government of Brazil for their efforts to protect the natives, the church as an organization never found it easy to adopt a progressive stance. In the very long run, this meant that in the politics of independent Latin America, liberalism would take on the associations of anti clericalism it was to have in Catholic Europe. This was all in marked contrast to the religiously pluralistic society which was taking root contemporaneously in British North America. For all the spectacular inflow of bullion from the mainland colonies, it was the Caribbean islands which were of the greatest economic importance to Europe throughout most of the early modern period. This importance rested on their agricultural produce, above all on sugar, introduced first by the Arabs to Europe in Sicily and Spain, and then carried by Europeans first to Madeira and the Canaries, and then to the New World. Both the Caribbean and Brazil were transformed economically by this crop. Medieval man had sweetened his food with honey. By 1700, sugar, though still expensive, was a European necessity. It was, with tobacco, hardwood, and coffee, the main product of the islands and the taproot of burgeoning African slave trade. Together, these exports gave the planters great importance in the affairs of their metropolitan countries. The story of the large scale Caribbean agriculture began with the Spanish settlers, who quickly started growing fruit which they had brought from Europe and raising cattle. When they introduced rice and sugar, production was for a long time held back by a shortage of labor as the native populations of the islands succumbed to European ill treatment and disease. The next economic phase was the establishment by later arrivals of parasitic industries, piracy, and smuggling. The Spanish occupation of the larger Caribbean islands, the Greater Antilles, still left hundreds of smaller islands unoccupied, most of them on the Atlantic fringe. These attracted the attention of English, French, and Dutch captains, who found them useful as bases from which to prey on Spanish ships going home from New Spain and for contraband trade with the Spanish colonists who wanted their goods. European settlements appeared too on the Venezuelan coast where there was salt to be had for preserving meats, where individuals led governmental enterprises in the form of English royal concessions and the Dutch West India Company followed in the 17th century. By then, the English had for decades been looking for suitable places for what contemporaries called plantations, that is, settler colonies in the New World. They tried the North American mainland first. Then, in the 1620s, they established their first two successful West Indian colonies on St. Christopher in the Leeward Isles and Barbados. Both prospered, By 1630, St. Christopher had about 3,000 inhabitants and Barbados about 2,000. This success was based on tobacco, the drug which, with syphilis, believed to have been in Europe at Cadiz in 1493, and the cheap automobile. Some have thought to be the New World's revenge for its violation by the Old. These tobacco colonies rapidly became of great importance to England, not only because of the customs revenue they supplied, but also because the new growth of population in the Caribbean stimulated demands for exports and provided fresh opportunities for interloping in the trade of Spanish Empire. Soon, the English were joined by the French in this lucrative business, the French occupying the Windward Isles, the English the rest of the leewards. In the 1640s, there were about 7,000 French in the West Indies and over 50,000 English. After this time, the tide of English immigration was diverted from the New World to North America and the West Indies, were not again to reach such high figures of white settlement. This was partly because sugar joined tobacco as a staple crop. Tobacco can be produced economically in small quantities. It had therefore suited the multiplication of small holdings and the building up of a large immigrant population of whites. Sugar was economic only if cultivated in large units. It suited the big plantation, worked by large numbers, and these were likely to be black slaves, given the decline of the local population in the 16th century. The Dutch supplied the slaves and aspired to the sort of general commercial monopoly in the Western Hemisphere, which they were winning in the Far East, working out of a base at the mouth of the Hudson River, New Amsterdam. This was the beginning of a great demographic change in the Caribbean. In 1643, Barbados had 37,000 white inhabitants and only 6,000 black African slaves. By 1660, there were over 50,000 of the latter. With the appearance of sugar, the French colonies of Guadeloupe and Martinique took on a new importance and they too wanted slaves. A complex process of growth was underway. The huge and growing Caribbean market for slaves and important European goods was added to that already offered by a Spanish empire, increasingly unable to defend its economic monopoly. This fixed the role of the West Indies in the relationships of the powers of the next century. They were long a prey to disorder. The Caribbean, an area where colonial frontiers met and policing was poor, and there were great prizes to be won. In one year, a Dutch captain took the great flota, bearing home the year's treasure from Indies to Spain. Not surprisingly, they became the classical and indeed legendary hunting ground of pirates, whose heyday was the last quarter of the 17th century. Gradually, the great powers fought out their disputes until they arrived at acceptable agreements, but this was to take a long time. Meanwhile, through the 18th century, the West Indies and Brazil provided the great market for slaves and sustained most of that trade. As time passed, it too became involved in another economy besides those of Europe, Africa, and New Spain, that of a new North America. For a long time, by all the standards of classical colonial theory, settlement in North America was a poor second in attractiveness to Latin America or the Caribbean. Precious metals were not discovered there, and though there were furs in the north, there seemed to be little else that Europe wanted from that region. Yet there was nowhere else to go, given the Spanish monopoly to the south, and a great many nations tried it. The Spanish expansion north of the Rio Grande need not concern us, for it was hardly an occupation, more of a missionary exercise. while Spanish Florida's importance was strategical, for it gave some protection to Spanish communications with Europe by the northern outlet from the Caribbean. It was the settlement of the Atlantic coast which drew other Europeans. There was, even briefly, a new Sweden, taking its place besides New Netherlands, New England, and New France. The motives for settling North America were often those which operated elsewhere, though the crusading missionary zeal of the reconquest mentality was almost entirely missing further north. For most of the 16th century, the Englishmen, who were the most frequent explorers of North American possibilities, thought there might be mines there to rival those of the Spanish Indies. Others believed that the population pressure made immigration desirable, and increasing knowledge revealed ample land in temperate climates with, unlike Mexico, very few native inhabitants. There was also a constant pull in the lure of finding a northwest passage to Asia. By 1600, these impulses had produced much exploration, but only one unsuccessful settlement north of Florida, at Roanoke, Virginia. The English were too weak, the French too distracted to achieve more. With the 17th century, there came more strenuous, better organized, and better financed efforts. The discovery of the possibility of growing some important staples on the mainland, a set of political changes in England which favored immigration, and the emergence of England as a great naval power. Between them, these facts brought about a revolutionary transformation of the Atlantic littoral. The wilderness of 1600, inhabited by a few Indians, was 100 years later an important site of civilization. In many places, settlers had pushed as far inland as the mountain barrier of the Alleghenies. Meanwhile, the French had established a line of posts along the valley of St. Lawrence and the Great Lakes. In this huge right angle of settlement lived about 500,000 white people, mainly of British and French stock. Spain claimed that all North America, but this had long been contested by the English on the ground that prescription without possession availeth nothing. The Elizabethan adventurers had explored much of the coast and gave the name Virginia in honor of their queen to all the territory north of 30 degrees of latitude. In 1606, James I granted a charter to a Virginia company to establish colonies. This was only formally the beginning. The company's affairs soon required revision of its structure and there were unprofitable initiatives in plenty. But in 1607, there was already established the first English settlement in America, which was to survive at Jamestown in modern Virginia. It only just came through its early trials, but by 1620, its starving time was far behind it and it prospered. In 1608, the year after Jamestown's foundation, the French explorer Samuel de Champlain built a small fort at Quebec. For the immediate future, the French colony was so insecure that its food had to be brought from France, but it was the beginning of the settlement in Canada. Finally, in 1609, the Dutch sent an English explorer, Henry Hudson, to find a northeast passage to Asia. When he was unsuccessful, he turned completely around and sailed across the Atlantic to look for a northwestern one. Instead, he discovered the river that bears his name and established a preliminary Dutch claim by doing so. Within a few years, there were Dutch settlements along the river on Manhattan and on Long Island. The English were in the lead and remained so. They prospered because of two new facts. One was the technique, of which they were the first and most successful exponents, of transporting whole communities, men, women, and children. These set up agricultural colonies which worked the land with their own labor and soon became independent of the mother country for their livelihood. The second was the discovery of tobacco, which became a staple first for Virginia and then for Maryland, a colony whose settlement began in 1634. Further north, the availability of land which could be cultivated on European lines assured the survival of the colonies. Although interest in the area had originally been awoken by the prospects of fur trading and fishery, there was soon a small surplus of grain for export. There was an attractive prospect for land hungry Englishmen in the country, widely believed in the early 17th century to be overpopulated. Something like 20,000 went to New England in the 1630s. Another distinctive feature of the New England colonies was their association with religious dissent and Calvinistic Protestantism. They would not have been what they were without the Reformation, although the usual economic motives were at work in the settlements. The leadership among immigrants to Massachusetts in the 1630s of men associated with the Puritan wing of English Protestantism bore fruit in a group of colonies whose constitutions varied from theocratic oligarchy to democracy. Though sometimes led by members of the English gentry, they shed more rapidly than the southern colonies their inhibitions about radical departures from English social and political practice, and their religious nonconformity did as much as the conditions in which they had to survive to bring this about. At some moments during the English constitutional troubles of the mid century, it even seemed that the colonies of New England might escape from the control of the crown altogether, but this did not happen. After the Dutch settlements of what was subsequently New York State had been swallowed up by the English, the North American littoral in 1700 from Florida north to the Kennebec River was organized as 12 colonies. A 13th, Georgia, appeared in 1732, in which lived some 400,000 whites and perhaps a tenth as many black slaves. Further north lay still disputed territory, and then lands that were indisputably French. In these, colonists were much thinner on the ground than in the English settlements. There were perhaps 15,000 French in North America in all, and they had benefited from no such large migrations of communities as had the English colonies. Many of them were hunters and trappers, missionaries and explorers, strung out over the length of St. Lawrence and dotted about in the Great Lakes region and even beyond. New France was a huge area on the map, but outside the St. Lawrence Valley and Quebec, it was only a scatter of strategically and commercially important forts and trading posts. Nor was destiny of settlement the only difference between the French and English colonial zones. New France was closely supervised from home. After 1663, a company structure had been abandoned in favor of direct royal rule, and Canada was governed by a French governor, with the advice of the intendant, much as a French province was governed at home. There was no religious liberty. The church in Canada was monopolistic and missionary. Its history is full of glorious examples of bravery and martyrdom, and also of bitter intransigence. The farms of the settled areas were grouped in seigneuries, a device which had some value in decentralizing administrative responsibility. Social forms, therefore, reproduced those of Old World much more than those of the English settlements, even to the extent of throwing up a nobility with Canadian titles. The English colonies were very diverse, strung out as they were over almost the whole Atlantic seaboard. They contained a great variety of climate, economy, and terrain. Their origins reflected a wide range of motives and methods of foundation. They soon became somewhat ethnically mixed, for after 1688, Scottish, Irish, German, Huguenot, and Swiss immigrants had begun to arrive in appreciable numbers, though for a very long time the predominance of the English language and the relatively small numbers of non English speaking immigrants would maintain a culture overwhelmingly Anglo Saxon. There was religious diversity, and even by 1700, a large measure of effective religious toleration, though some of the colonies had close association with specific religious dominations. All this increased the colonies' difficulty in seeing themselves as one society. They had no American center. The crown and the home country were the foci of the colony's collective life, as English culture was still their background. Nonetheless, it was already obvious that the English North American colonies offered individuals opportunities for advancement, unavailable either in the more strictly and closely regulated society of Canada or at home in Europe. By 1700, some colonies had already shown a tendency to grasp whatever freedom from royal control was available to them. It is tempting to look back a long way for evidence of the spirit of independence, which was later to play so big a part in popular tradition. In fact, it would be a misconception to read the prehistory of United States in these terms. The Pilgrim Fathers who landed at Cape Cod in 1620 were not rediscovered or inserted in their prominent place in the national mythology until the end of the 18th century. Yet they had indeed wanted to make a New England. What can be seen much earlier than the idea of independence is the emergence of facts which would in the future make it easier to think in terms of independence and unity. One was the slow strengthening of a representative tradition in the first century of settlement. For all their initial diversity, in the early 18th century, each colony settled down to work through some sort of representative assembly, which spoke for its inhabitants to a royal governor appointed in London. Some of the settlements had needed to cooperate with one another against the Indians at an early date, and in the French wars, this had become even more important. When the French loosened their Huron allies against the British colonists, it helped to create a sense of common interest among the individual colonies, as well as spurring on the British to enlist on their side the Iroquois, the hereditary foes of the Huron. From economic diversity, too, a measure of economic interrelatedness was emerging. The middle and southern colonies produced plantation crops of rice, tobacco, indigo, and timber. New England built ships, refined and distilled molasses and grain spirits, grew corn and fished. There was a growing feeling and an apparent logic in thinking that the Americans might perhaps be able to run their affairs in their own interests, including that of the West Indian colonies, better than in that of the mother country. Economic growth was changing attitudes too. The northern mainland colonies of New England were, on the whole, underpriced and even disliked in the mother country. They competed in shipbuilding and illegally in the Caribbean trade. Unlike plantation colonies, they produced nothing that the mother country wanted. Besides, they were full of religious dissenters. In the 18th century, British America made great progress in wealth and civilization. The total colonial population had continued to grow and was well over a million by halfway through the century. It was being pointed out in the 1760s that the mainland colonies were going to be worth much more to Great Britain than the West Indies had been. By 1763, Philadelphia could rival many European cities in stylishness and cultivation. A great uncertainty had been removed in 1763 too, for Canada had been conquered and was by the peace treaty of that year to remain British. This changed the outlook of many Americans both towards the value of protection afforded by the imperial government and towards the question of further expansion to the west. As farming settlers tended to fill up the coastal plain, they came to press through the mountain barrier and down the river valleys beyond, eventually to the upper Ohio and northwest. The danger of conflict with the French as a result was now removed, but this was not the only consideration which faced the British government in handling this movement after 1763. There were the rights and the likely reactions of the Indians to take into account. To antagonize them would be to court danger, but if Indian wars were to be avoided by holding the colonists back, then the frontier would have to be policed by British troops for that purpose too. The result was a decision of government in London to impose a Western land policy, which would limit expansion to raise taxes in the colonies to pay for the costs of the defending forces and to tighten up the commercial system and to cease to wink at infringements in its working. It was unfortunate that all this was coming to a head in the last years in which the old assumptions about the economics of colonial dependencies and their relationship to mother country were accepted without demur by the markers of colonial policy. By then, about 2.5 centuries had gone by since European settlements in the New World began. The overall effect of expansion in the Americas upon European history had already been immense, but is far from easy to define. Eventually, it is clear all the colonial powers had by the 18th century been able to extract some economic profit from their colonies, though they did so in different ways. The flow of silver to Spain was the most obvious, and this had, of course, implications for the European economy as a whole and even for Asia. Growing colonial populations also helped to stimulate European exports and manufacturers. In this respect, the English colonies were of the greatest importance, pointing the way to a growing flow of people from Europe, which was to culminate in the last of that continent's major folk migrations in the 19th and early 20th centuries. To colonial expansion, too, must be linked the enormous growth of European shipping and shipbuilding. Whether engaged in slaving, contraband trading, legal import and export between metropolis and colony, or fishing to supply new consumer markets, shipbuilders, ship owners, and captains benefited. There was an incremental and incalculable effect at work. It is thus very hard to sum up the total effect of the possession of the American colonies on the imperialist powers in the first age of imperialism. Of the overriding cultural and political importance of that fact in the long run, we can speak with more confidence. The Western Hemisphere was to be culturally European. Spanish, Portuguese, and English might be very different, but they offered edited version of the same text. They all brought selections from European civilization with them. Politically, that was to mean that from Tierra del Fuego to Hudson Bay, Two continents would eventually be organized on European legal and administrative principles, even when they ceased to remain dependent on colonial power. The hemisphere was also going to be Christian. When Hinduism or Islam eventually made their appearance there, it would be as the possession of small minorities, not as rivals to a basically Christian culture. More specifically, within these generalities, great political importance was to lie in the further differentiation of the Americas, North and South. It had been true that in cultural terms, North American native life could offer no such impressive human achievements as the civilizations of Central and South America. But colonialism was a differentiating fact too. It is not fanciful to recall ancient parallels. The colonies of the ancient Greek cities were set up by their parent states as communities largely independent in the way similar to English settlements of the North American littoral. Once established, they tended to evolve towards a self conscious identity of their own. The Spanish Empire displayed the deployment of a regular pattern of institutions, essentially metropolitan and imperial, rather, as had done the provinces of imperial Rome. It took time for it to be clear that the basic forms already given to the evolution of British North America were to shape the kernel of a future world power. That evolution was therefore to prove a sharper of world as well as American history. Two great transforming factors had still to operate before the North American future was fixed in its main lines. The differing environments revealed as the northern continent filled up by movement to the west and a much greater flow of non Anglo Saxon immigration. But these forces would flow into and around molds set by the English inheritance, which would leave its mark on the future United States as Byzantium left its own on Russia. Nations do not shake off their origins, they only learn to view them in different ways. Sometimes outsiders can see this best. It was a German statesman who remarked towards the end of the 19th century that its most important international fact was that Great Britain and the United States spoke the same language.